Alrighty, how you doing? Welcome back. Let's continue on with our course. So in this video, you're going to finally kind of get to see peerScholar in action and get a clearer sense. In fact, what we're going to focus on, as suggested here, is the student side of the application, what it's like to be a student and go through a peerScholar activity. And we'll visit some of the interfaces along the way and talk about some of the pedagogy as well. A couple of housekeeping things at the top. First of all, I want to be clear that in fact peerScholar can be used in right now at least 3 different ways, and with potentially more to come. To give you the sort of mile-high version of this, what we're trying to do is, we've got the peer assessment, self-assessment, formative stuff all under the hood, so to speak, but professors might want to use it in different ways in their class, depending on the pedagogical goals they're trying to reach. And so we have already built out a few different ways that you can harness all this power. There will be more to come, but these are the 3 right now. So just to kind of highlight what they are and how they're different, just quickly for now, the classic model is the one we're going to focus on for the rest of this video, and in fact for a little while. The classic model involves single students responding to some query from their instructor and then assessing other individual students who responded to the same query. All right, so all of the students are essentially doing the same kind of work, and they're peering assessing each other as they go along. Case study is a twist on that. It allows you to create 2 groups. So for example, the classic usage, well, in fact, it allows you to create multiple groups, but the classic use is in a business context or a case study context, an instructor might tell the class, you actually are going to have to learn 2 cases for this activity. Let's call them case A and case B. You are going to write about one of them, let's say case A, but when you assess, you're going to assess classmates who wrote about the other case. All right, so if you wrote about A, now you're going to assess the B's, etc. And in fact, you can have multiple groups and you can control how all the assessment is done. They really like this approach in the case study context because it encourages students to kind of look at the clever ideas their classmates have had in a different context and kind of see if they can transplant some of those to their context, which is a skill they're trying to work on in that case. Okay. The third one is group work. And so in the group work case, students submit as a group, they assess as a group, they reflect as a group, so they're doing all their work now as a group. But critically, at the end of all of that, they also assess the individual contributions of each group member. And this is done anonymously. So if you're in one of these groups, you know that at the end, everybody else in the group is going to assess your contribution to the project. And this is really critical because there's a lot of research that shows that students hate group work because somebody, usually multiple people, tend to not do much. But as soon as they know they're going to be assessed, now they work hard to make a contribution, and suddenly the group work works so much better. And so, that's a really cool tool for that. Now, the case study and the group work modules we're going to have separate videos on. I'm going to focus on those. So for now, we're going to focus on the classic. Okay. And one other quick thing on the outset. There's 2 different ways peerScholar can be used. It can be integrated with your learning management system, or it can be used as a standalone platform. We're going to be showing you it as a standalone platform, but many of you will probably be using an integrated version, and there are subtle differences in terms of sort of where you land and things, and so I'll try to point those out. So just quickly, in terms of integrated, peerScholar is something called LTI 2.0, so Learning Tool Interoperability. It's a standard, and so peerScholar conforms to that standard. Most learning management systems also conform to that standard, and what that means is it's very quick and easy to integrate. Literally, inputting a couple of pieces of information into your LMS and it's done. So that's cool. And once it's integrated, it allows single sign-on, it allows roster syncing, and it allows a grade to be passed back to the LMS. Now, It does also change the flow a little bit, specifically because you're already in the LMS and you're in your course shell. When you launch into peerScholar, you launch directly into the activity for that course. You don't have to kind of choose the course and get to the right level. peerScholar brings you right to that right level. And so some of the screens you're going to see today, you actually will not see in the integrated version. Which is cool. The critical ones obviously will be there. In the standalone version, people can use it as a standalone, and depending on where things are at your institution, it's possible that this is how it's being used. When you're using the standalone, there is a little bit more setup required. So specifically, the faculty that's using it have to register an account. They have to create a course within that, and then they have to invite students, which they can do simply by sharing a URL or a number of other options. And then students will get the invite, they will have to register if necessary, and then join the class. And so there's a little bit of getting everybody together in the same space. And in this case, when students do come into the application, they will come in at what we call the course level, so they have to choose which course they're working within, etc. So you're going to kind of see that laid out. All right, but other than that, let's just kind of get at it. Let's give you a sense of what this little critter looks like. All right, so I've already logged in here as a student. Now let me actually just show you that process. Just why not? Instead of just sort of jumping ahead. So I'm demo student here. So in the standalone, when you log in as a student, you first see tiles for every course you're in, and notice that a given individual might have different roles in different courses. But I'm going to jump right into this course, the research ethics course. And okay, so again, in the standalone, you may see multiple activities. So each horizontal line here is an activity with a title, and then these 3 stages: create, assess, reflect. So in this case, you see 5 activities laid out there. If you're ever using the integrated version, you'll only ever see 1 activity, because it jumps you right into a very specific activity. That has to be the case because it can only pass 1 grade back to the LMS, and so we want the grade for that activity. So each link from the LMS will bring you just to a single line like this. Okay. In most cases, an activity in peerScholar will march along these 3 phases. It'll start in create, it'll go to assess, and it'll go to reflect, and the open phase is shown here in green. So a student could click right in and get into that phase. I am going to be focusing on these demos down here, and these are actually just copies of the same activity, but I've just got different phases open so that I can easily jump from one to another. So this just allows me to show it to you. Okay, so let's do that. So if I come in as a student and the create phase is open, I click into that. The instructions, the first time a student clicks in, always the instructions will open up for them in the front like this. And basically the instructions are just the instructor letting the student know what they want them to do. Now, there's some sort of nice features. One is you can embed videos, and you can embed any digital product. So if you do want your students to watch something before they get to work, you can have them do that. I'll show you how I use that a lot in the next 2 phases, especially. You can also include attachments. I'm going to open up this attachment. And I'm going to show you how we connect to it when we get to the assess phase. So here is the attachment. It's a PDF, and it's what's called an argument writing rubric. And so you'd obviously want this aligned with the task. So the task that students have here is to create an argument around this research ethics question. And so you can tell them ahead of time, I'm going to ask you to create an argument, and we're going to assess each other. And these are, this will guide you. This will give you a sense of what a good argument looks like. So you should worry about, how well you express the ideas and purpose. You should worry about your organization. You should be providing evidence to support. You want to get your language and vocabulary right, and you want to use the proper conventions. And so this breaks it down for the student, and also with the wording in the cells, it gives them a sense of the difference between, not very good on that given metric and much higher. Okay, so the students have this before they even start writing, which is great, and we're going to come back to it. So I'm just going to leave it open. Okay, but students would read the instructions, watch the video, look at the attachments, and then they would do their thing. And their thing might be writing, so they could just write here. Notice they can also embed videos or various other things as well. So just like the instructor with the instructions, the students can have any sort of digital product they wish in their written compositions. You can also, by the way, just ask them to submit a digital product using the attach here. So you could, if you, for example, just wanted them to create a video about something, they could just attach the file with their video and needn't write at all. In fact, with some of the settings, you can control this interface. Do you even want them to see this text box? Do you just want them to see the attachment? Do you just want them to see the text box, etc.? You can configure that, okay? I'm also going to highlight something else really quickly as I go through. Something I'm going to start referring to as additional assessments. Within each phase, there's the main task, and in this case, it's to produce a composition. But you can also, as students sort of are done the main task, but before they leave peerScholar, you can ask them questions. Anything you want. It turns out this is a really powerful feature. Here's one example. So in this case, here's a couple of questions that might be used by, say, an instructor who's never given this activity before, and maybe they want to collect a bit of data. Maybe they want to know how interesting students find the activity. We know that the more engaging an activity it is, the better the learning is. So they could actually get a little bit of data. They could also ask about how many hours did you spend actually researching and creating the composition. So once again, just an example of how, if you're interested, you could get a little bit of data from your students at this point in time, whether it be for research purposes or just to inform yourself. You're going to see a couple of other examples here. Okay, but that's the create phase. Pretty simple. Things get a little more exotic next. So let's imagine we have a class of students. They've all they've all done their composition and submitted it, and time goes by and the assess phase opens. So they then log back in. Instructions again, the first time would open up automatically, and they go through and they read the instructions. Now, let me read you just a little bit here. Now it's your turn to be the teacher. In this phase, you will be shown the work of your peers, and your primary task will be to analyze each peer's work carefully and provide them with useful feedback. So we're going to let the student be the teacher to some extent, which in and of itself is kind of a cool pedagogical thing. It empowers the student, literally, and it gives them a real sense of what it is like to assess work and how difficult it is. In fact, it's that difficulty that's going to engage the critical thinking and the creative thinking that is the whole goal of this. All right. So students, by the way, enjoy this. They find this a very powerful learning experience and an interesting learning experience. All right. So I did suggest that I was going to show you how I might use video, and this is one example. So within the instructions, again, we're going to ask students to be giving feedback to their peers, so you could preface that with something like this.
Delivering negative feedback to your employees can be awkward, uncomfortable, and let's face it, a little intimidating. As a manager,
okay, so I like to have a video like this for a couple of reasons. One is this person is going to explain to the students what good critical feedback looks like. She's going to highlight 5 characteristics. I'll show you those later. But she's also putting it in a authentic context, right? She's talking about these are skills you will use after you graduate when you're in a work context. And I like to connect students' minds to that, because that is the goal, right? We are teaching them transferable skills that will help them succeed. And so always good to make that clear to the students so that they buy in and then they learn better when they do that, okay? You can also link, here's a case where I've linked out to an institutional site that talks about what good feedback looks like and how to learn from it. The point being here, you can do whatever you wish within the instructions. Again, we still have the rubric connected. Okay, that's the same rubric that's still open over here. Let me come back to that in just a moment. You'll see how we use it. Okay. So now the student has read the instructions and they're ready to go. What does that mean? Well, what they say here in step 1 is a set of peers. In this case, we've set that number to 5. It can be any number you wish. And so literally as I flip between the peers, what's changing here is the work underneath. And so this is peer 1 submission. So notice that these are anonymously presented. The student does not know who they are assessing. They were randomly selected, pseudo-randomly. We could get into that, but let's call it randomly for now. And the student, their job is to assess the work. Two ways they do that. One is with these sort of inline comments where you can just literally select a bit of text and attach some comment to it. Okay, so you can do that directly to the text. That's really good for what I think of as lower level stuff. So sentence structure, paragraph structure, grammar, citations, things like that. Stylistic kind of issues can be really pointed out very nicely with these inline comments. In addition, though, on the right, we have what we call the assessment form. This assessment form would be created by the instructor, and in the next video we'll talk about how this actually comes to be. But this is the instructor using a series of tools to guide the student through the analysis they want them to perform. Okay, and so in this case, for example, the instructor has started by saying, give this a grade out of 10, just to get your head around how good you think it is. And so maybe I think, okay, this is a 7. All right, now we're getting right to the constructive comment here. Keeping in mind all the things you learned from that video you just watched, give the student some constructive feedback. And so this is where, the real heavy work happens with the transferable skills, because in order to give the student constructive feedback, you first need to think critically about, what are the weaknesses in this work? Then you have to think creatively, how could it be improved? What could the student do differently that would make the work better? And then you have to communicate all of this to this peer, right? In hopefully a way that fits well with what you're learning about in terms of how to give good feedback. And so you're engaging all of these skills to do this for peer 1. Now, let me highlight, you're going to engage them again for peer 2, and for peer 3, and for peer 4, and for peer 5. This is the repeated structured practice I make such a big deal out of. Students are using these skills in a structured way to assess each peer, and then they use it in a repeated way. And that's what's kind of developing these skills over time. Okay, let me just show a couple of other examples of what you can add to a form to give you a sense of the richness. What we've done here is, well, you remember that rubric? We've mimicked the rubric here. So if I go back to the rubric now, and let's look a little more closely, these were the subcomponents: ideas and purpose, organization, elaboration. Each of them could be scored on a 1 to 4 scale. So a student can consult this. They just read a peer's work and they could think, how clear were the ideas and purposes? Oh, well, okay, the claim is clearly stated, focused and consistent. Yeah, I think it's somewhere around 3. And so they could literally give it a 3 here. And go on to organization, go on to elaboration of evidence. And so we can have students actually applying a rubric to the work of their peers. That's very cool because it means that we're ultimately getting measures of the peers' skills. At least whatever the rubric is measuring, we're getting those measures, and they can be very powerful, as our research shows. But you can go ahead and do other things. So here's one where we're actually getting at how powerful was the argument. So basically what this says is, hey, if somebody didn't believe this person's perspective going in, after they read it, do you think you would sway them? Would the person be more swayed to the author's perspective on this issue? And so how persuasive was it, on a 5-point scale? So you can ask all these questions. Again, critical point, you're giving them structure as they analyze each peer's work, and they do it over and over and over and over. Okay. Now, let me put on my pedagogical hat for just a moment. While they're seeing all these peers' work, remember, this is work that they themselves have done, right? They did this project themselves. So now they're seeing some peers, probably some of whom did it better than they did, and some who did it not as well. And so they're seeing a spectrum, and they're learning kind of where their work fits. This is what's called metacognitive awareness. They're kind of seeing their own strengths and weaknesses simply by assessing their peers. But we can put an exclamation point on that by also asking them to explicitly assess their own work as well. So this is my work now, And now I've changed the form, and you will see when we talk about the faculty side, you can use the same form as you want, and that's the easy. You can just click a little box and now they assess themselves just like they assess their peers. Or you can customize the self-assessment. And I've customized it here. What grade would you give yourself? But then I have highlight one thing you learned from this experience that you could work on to improve your work going forward. All right, so this is a real metacognitive reflective kind of prompt. What did you learn and what will you do differently going forward? And so by simply getting students to think about that and answering it, you're boosting up that sort of metacognitive learning that's going on. Okay, very cool. Finally, in this phase, remember I said you can have these questions sort of as students go out the door, these additional assessments, we're going to call them. Here's another way you might use it. So in this case, we're using it to obtain informed consent from students. So let's say we wanted to use their data for research, and peerScholar is a really powerful tool for collecting research data. Well, as I assume we have ethics in, and part of the ethics is we said we would get informed consent from our participants. And so this is, where you can put the prompt. We would like to use your ratings for research purposes. We're going to keep your data confidential. We're going to protect it, all that kind of stuff. And then students can actually choose to either say, yep, I'm okay with my data being used, or no, I would rather it not be used, etc. And so we can actually obtain that within the application. Again, just another use for the additional questions. Okay, so let's jump back here. All your students composed. They then log in and they assess one another. Now, as a given student is assessing 5 peers, 5 of their peers are assessing them. So in the third and final stage, it's all about learning from feedback, okay? So in this stage, again, students would log in, again, instructions would open up, and they would be, getting the notion of, well, this phase is intended to help you learn how to effectively improve your work based on feedback you receive. Okay, that's what this is all about. So it's very metacognitive because it's going to be all about my work and how my work can be better. But you see, we're going to get this repeated structured practice with critical thinking and creative thinking, all that stuff going again here. But before we do all that, again, we might want to include various links that are sort of relevant to what's going on. And even, this is just a different example of a video, this is a TEDx video where the presenter is talking about the importance of learning from feedback. Once again, I'm trying to situate this skill they're learning in the bigger picture of their life and their future. And so this presenter talks about how to be successful in a work environment, to be successful in life in general, if you can learn how to learn from feedback, how to listen to it, think about it, decide what you believe, and then implement the stuff that you think is good, that if you get good at doing that, that's going to pay dividends all through your life. And so again, I like students to watch this just to kind of motivate them and get the buy-in so that they realize, hey, what I'm about to do is valuable. Okay, it's valuable to my future. Okay, cool. So then they do it. So what do? Well, this looks sort of similar to the other thing, except you see the panes have kind of been flipped. That's because this over here on the right is my work. In fact, if I flip from peer to peer, you see that the work on the right isn't changing. I mean, the yellow parts are changing, but otherwise, the work is not changing, because what we're actually seeing here is, if I go back to peer 1, this is what peer 1 thought about my work. Okay, this is the feedback from peer 1. And so peer 1 provided some inline comments. Those are the yellow bits. They also provided a grade, rubric ratings, and they also provided the constructive feedback. Okay, as did peer 2, as did peer 3, etc. And so we can go through peer by peer, and we can see some of this feedback as it was presented. Now, it's great to see feedback, but most of the research suggests that if you just show students feedback and that's it, they barely look at it, and if they do look at it, they don't process it very deeply and they don't think about it deeply. Given the importance of learning from feedback, we want to change that, okay? And so we kind of do that in a couple of ways that are options for the instructor who uses peerScholar. So the first one is we actually ask them to assess the feedback, okay? So you got some feedback from this peer, in this case peer 4, and so see under here it says rate the feedback. So you flip up this rating form, and now we're going to ask you some questions about the feedback, and that's going to again guide you through the analysis. At the top I have a simple set of questions. You could ask them, how useful did you think the feedback was? How did it make you feel? These are two different aspects of feedback you could have students kind of thinking about. I'm going to highlight the 5 questions here because I just want to show you how we can connect back to that video. Remember the video in the assess phase where I said students were told here are 5 characteristics of constructive feedback. 5 things you should keep in mind while you're giving constructive feedback. So we gave the students that before they started giving each other constructive feedback. Well, now that they're looking at the feedback they received, we can return to that, okay? And we can really strengthen that learning. So for example, one of the things she said is that good feedback focuses on the strengths and weaknesses of the work rather than making it about the author's strengths and weaknesses. So in a sense, don't make it personal. Make it about the work, not about the person who did the work. So now that I'm looking at what this peer said to me, I can say, well, how well did they do that? And maybe I think they were a 4. They did that pretty well. Here's the sandwich approach, which essentially says when you're giving someone constructive feedback, start with something good and end with something good, and put the tough constructive stuff in the middle. That, pardon the pun, makes it easier to digest, and so etc. So you can go through these various characteristics, and what's going on here now as students do this? Well, one of the things is they're learning a lot more about what good feedback looks like in general, but they're also thinking more about this person's feedback to me. Okay, we're really guiding them through, and so they're once again critically thinking, they're creatively thinking. So this person is suggesting you should do this. So I'm thinking, well, what if I did that? Would it make my work better? So we're creatively thinking, and we're doing this all in what we call a receptive communication context. That is, we're not talking, we're listening. Okay, we're sitting there listening to the feedback coming in, so receiving the information and learning how to listen is a skill in and of itself. And so students are getting that practice. They're listening, they're critically thinking and creatively thinking about what they're listening to. And once again, so we have the structure and we also have the repetition, right? They do it for peer 1, they do it for peer 2, they do it for peer 3, they do it for peer 4, etc. So more repeated structured practice with those skills and more skill development. Now, after they've analyzed all the work from their peers, they can be asked to actually revise their work. They can be told, hey, you just had 5 peers give you ideas about how your work could be better. This one over here, this is the one that your professor will grade. So go ahead and make it better. If you think they had some ideas, then before it's graded, go ahead and make your work better. So for example, I'm sure somebody would have told this person to use paragraph structure. And I'm not sure this is the best place to put paragraphs in this one. I'm just kind of doing it on the fly here. But maybe that's one of the things they do is they decide, okay, I'm going to make it more paragraph structure, and they go ahead and make any other changes they want to make before they finally save the new version that they've just created. Okay, so this is what's called a formative use of feedback. Actually, not just looking at the feedback, but actively using it immediately to make something better. And that's what we want people to do with feedback, right? We want them to learn and improve. And so this gives them experience learning from the feedback and then improving some product on its basis. All right, cool. Do you want to really hit that over the head again? Well, let me show you how, with again an additional question, you can kind of make peerScholar into whatever tool you want it to be. So for example, let's say I really want students to learn from the feedback and I really want to push them to be engaged very deeply in this phase. Well, here's something I do. After they've done everything, I say, okay, now you're going to do a justification of revisions. So use the space below to show us you thought deeply about the feedback you received. Do this by explaining how you revised your work to integrate the feedback you found useful, but especially in cases where you ignored suggestions, provide your rationale for doing so. So we're not going to let students just ignore some point. They're at least going to have to respond to it here. Okay? They're going to have to say, I didn't do what peer 2 said, and here is why. Okay, and so that's going to make them at least think a lot about peer 2, and maybe while they're doing that, they're thinking, oh, geez, I probably should have done what peer 2 said. In which case they can go back and they can work more on their revision. And then they can end up saying, well, I did do what peer 2 said. So again, this is a nice way to use these additional assessments to kind of ratchet up the learning that's going on. Just another example. Okay, so that was kind of, I'd like to make all these videos relatively short, relatively punchy, but some of them, take a little bit of time to walk through, and I hope you found that time valuable. That's a sort of generic student experience in the context of a written activity. As we go through the course, you will see that there's a lot of flexibility in the system, and there's a lot of other ways things can kind of unfold. I think the best way to begin to introduce you to that is to show you the instructor side of the application and give you a sense of some of the options that are available from the instructor side and the sorts of activities they produce. So that will be our next video. Thank you very much. I hope peerScholar is a little more concrete for you now, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Okay, bye-bye.